If your fasting insulin is high, you can restrict your calories and exercise all you want. And guess what? Until you actually correct the hormonal imbalance that's ongoing, you're not going to be able to lose weight.
Intermittent fasting, this is a topic that obviously you do a lot of education on publicly. What is the point? I mean, what is the point of intermittent fasting?
Well, there's a couple different ways that I could answer that. I think it's much more aligned with the way our bodies are designed to thrive, meaning if we embrace an ancestral health perspective, predating electricity and pasteurization and grocery stores, food scarcity was a real issue. And so therefore our bodies had to be able to sustain themselves without access to food for sometimes long periods of time. And unfortunately, in our hedonistic, materialistic, dopamine focused culture that we're in, we can have access to food all day and all night. I mean, Uber Eats is probably one of the worst things that could have happened to us as a society. And so when I think about intermittent fasting, when I think about metabolic flexibility, when I think about over 20 years of taking care of patients, one of the greatest travesties is that we eat too frequently and we eat the wrong combinations of foods. And so for me, this is a strategy that men and women can embrace through most of their adult lifetime very safely, but it's also very triggering. I mean, people want to do everything they can to disprove the science, to disprove that it's beneficial, to disprove all the health benefits. And so I feel like it's become a public health threat. And so I've even gotten more opinionated about intermittent fasting and meal frequency and food choices. And I know we're very aligned on the food piece. But when I talk about fasting, it's really eating less frequently. It doesn't have to be complicated. We want to make things complicated. We want to make things regimented. And I just remind people that if you look at all the major religions, this dates back to biblical times. It's not a fad. It's not something that's new. It may be something we're less familiarized with because we've been telling our patients for 30 plus years, breakfast is the most important meal of the day. Eat your snacks and mini meals, eat to stoke your metabolism. And that information has been metabolically detrimental to our health. And so it's no surprise that I feel so aligned with educating people about the benefits.
Yeah, I love that. So, I mean, I guess if you can paint a picture for our listeners, our viewers, the average American avatar, mm-hmm. What are the kinds of foods that they're eating, and when are they eating? Like what does that look like today?
Yeah. So if we're painting an avatar and we look at research that's been done. So in 2018, there was a UNC Chapel Hill study that was done that said that at that time, 88.2% of Americans were metabolically inflexible. So we're going to talk about degree of insulin resistance. The past 2 years have done us no benefit. So when I'm thinking about the average person, they eat too frequently. So as soon as they're getting up, they're having, their fatty coffee, or God forbid, they're having like fruit juice. And then they're eating a bunch of processed carbohydrates from the moment they wake up to the moment they go to bed. They're eating too little protein. They're eating too many processed carbs, and they're eating the wrong types of fats, like seed oils, or what I'm really kind of alluding to, like soybean oil and canola oil. And soybean oil is actually the most consumed fat in the United States right now, which is absolutely appalling. But it really begs to demonstrate how much processed foods people are eating. So it's not just the highly inflammatory, hyperpalatable foods, it's the meal frequency. We are eating every 2 to 3 hours. We are not properly fueling our bodies. So we can't make it from breakfast to lunch without having an energy slump and getting hangry and, wanting to go take a nap after eating a big lunch. That shouldn't be the case. And if we look at it from an ancestral health perspective, if that had been the case, if we fell asleep after a meal, we'd probably get eaten. It would not bide well for us. So there was a great study done by Sachin Panda, I believe last year, and it was an app in people's phone, and it was trying to calculate how frequently people were eating or drinking sugar sweetened beverages. And it was anywhere from 6 to 10 times a day. I've seen estimates as high as 14 to 15 times a day between sugar sweetened sodas, beverages, coffee, drinks. Frappuccino is like an abomination to our health. And so when you really think about the types of foods we choose to eat and the meal frequency, it is contributing to metabolic disease, high triglycerides, low HDL, insulin resistance and diabetes, hypertension or high blood pressure, making us prone to more cognitive issues, cognitive disorders, cardiovascular disease. I mean, the list goes on and on, certain types of cancers. And so I beg people to consider the fact that the foods we choose to eat can either be what helps or hinders our health. And the avatar that we're looking at right now is an increasingly unhealthy one. We're looking at BMIs that are, we're looking at young people. Like I look at my children who are teenagers, and most of their peers, because they're very active, they look pretty healthy. But I know when I talk to peers that work in inner cities, that work in more rural areas, the access to care, the access to high quality, nutrient dense whole foods is so limited. And, a lot of public assistance is one kind of indicator is not allowing people to have the opportunity to purchase nutrient dense whole foods. It's going to be the hyper palatable, bright, things in a bright bag or bright, I always say if it's red or blue or yellow, it's designed to attract our attention. And so it's probably nutrient devoid foods. So the avatar is increasingly unhealthy. The avatar is dealing with issues like rampant infertility, low testosterone in men, largely driven by insulin resistance. We're seeing infertility in both genders. Certainly we've got, it's that Pottinger's cat. So an unhealthy generation begets another unhealthy generation. And so all the epigenetic imprinting that we are seeing in infants and fetuses is just being propagated. And it's really, it's alarming and it's concerning. And so on a lot of levels, if we're really looking at what's happening to us as a population, it's a wake-up call. It really is.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, you mentioned two primary variables, at least two that we're going to talk about today, what we're eating and when we're eating. Are either of those variables more important than the other, or would you say that they're both sort of level importance?
I think they're both important because I think on a lot of levels, people assume if I'm intermittent fasting or if I'm eating less frequently, I can still eat whatever I want. So I remind people that if we're eating highly inflammatory, rancid seed oils, we're not eating enough protein, we're not eating to satiety, we're going to continue eating. So I think that they're equally important, but I know there are people who try very hard to out exercise or over fast to get beyond their meal choices. I think it all starts with our nutrition. In fact, I've been in a kind of a weird nebulous environment for probably the last 10 years because I was hearkening this 10 years ago, and my peers in cardiology thought it was cute. They would say, oh, the nurse practitioner wants to focus on food. And I said, guys, it all starts with food. It is so critically important. And yet we tell our patients to eat, Brummel and Brown and Smart Balance. And instead of eating real butter and eating whole milk, if you choose to eat dairy, and eating the meat and eating the fish. And instead we're encouraging people to eat food-like substances. And so I think they're equally important, but I would be the first person to say there are still plenty of people who try to out exercise, out fast their poor dietary choices, but it all starts with food.
And your background is as a nurse practitioner, right? So you're like in the field working with patients struggling with obesity, struggling with type 2 diabetes.
Yeah.
So I think you bring a really important clinical lens to this conversation.
Absolutely. And I think, for me, I loved everything about cardiology. I mean, to me, everything about the heart was fascinating, but I just kept looking at our patients. They're getting put on more medications. They were getting more stents. Maybe they had bypass again. Their diabetes was getting out of control. And I said, we're not making our patients healthier. We are just band-aiding everything that we're doing. And that should be of concern. And of course, all the cardiologists I work with were thin. All the nurse practitioners were thin because it just reinforced good habits because of what we saw our patients dealing with. But you have to wonder if what we're doing is ultimately improving quality of life, if all we're doing is just addressing symptoms instead of doing the hard work and saying, you really have to sleep more, you need to move your body, you need to eat less processed food, you need to eat less often, because those lifestyle pieces are critically important. I would advocate that is the most important thing we should be discussing with our patients. And yet we don't get reimbursed for it. And therefore we don't prioritize it. It's more important, like, okay, you're having shortness of breath, so we have to deal with that first, but let's not worry about all this other stuff. And maybe the shortness of breath is just exacerbated by all these lifestyle choices that someone's making. So you're never really getting to the root cause. And that was an endless source of frustration for me. Yeah.
How did you first hear about this concept of intermittent fasting, and what role has it played in your life?
It's a great question. So in 2016, I read Jason Fung's book, and that changed my life. I felt like I had the courage, like, okay, this is another clinician. He's a critical care doc. This is someone I can look up to. Reading his book gave me the courage to actually do it. And initially it was an N of one. It was really just me trying to get better grasp on going into perimenopause, this 5 to 10 years preceding menopause, when all of a sudden I'd never struggled with weight gain. And all of a sudden it became an issue along with other symptoms. And so I did intermittent fasting for myself. And then I had such great results that I started talking to all my patients and my friends and my family, anyone that was willing to listen to me. Because I felt like it was such a valuable strategy. And then that literally spilled into everything else I was doing. And the cardiologists they were humored. They thought it was funny. And I was like, it's really not funny, guys. This really can be effective. And so the rest is really history. It just became a large part of my business. I left clinical medicine in 2016 because I couldn't write another prescription. I was like, I can't do this. I really need to feel like I'm making a larger impact. And so it started with me, the N of one, and then really became part of a lot of the work that I was doing.
And interesting. And what were the results of note? Like, what was it, like weight stuff? What was it?
And yeah, not initially, but I felt so mentally clear and I had so much more energy. And I was like, hell, now I'm an entrepreneur. I have to really hustle. In my mind, I had to, I wanted to replace the income I was no longer making. But then it turned into weight loss and changes in body composition. And then the more I understood about autophagy, this waste and recycling process in the body that goes on, it just self-perpetuated. I had more energy than I had ever had. And I think, like many of us, you get into your 30s and maybe you're getting a little more tired, and then you get into your 40s and you kind of start to chalk up a lot of symptoms to, I'm now middle-aged. And all of a sudden I was like, I have as much energy as my kids. I have all boys. And so if I can keep up with them, I usually use that as a pretty good barometer, but it really did start that simply. And so for me, it gave me, I think it gave me my life back, and definitely a better perspective of saying, now I've always been compassionate, but even more compassionate for the struggles that, men and women experience when all of a sudden what used to work no longer works, because the exercise more, eat less motto doesn't work. That's not sustainable.
Why doesn't that work? Because you hear that over and over again from the halls of the Western medical and nutritional orthodoxy.
Yeah.
Right? It's all about calories in, calories out. Now, this isn't to refute the energy balance model. Mm-hmm. Calories matter, but why does that advice fail time and time again?
Well, and you're right. The law of thermodynamics still apply, but I think weight gain is certainly, or weight loss resistance, whatever it is someone's experiencing, is really a byproduct of hormonal dysregulation in the body. And if we discount that, if we don't take into account, like if your fasting insulin is high, guess what? You can restrict your calories and exercise all you want. And guess what? Until you actually correct the hormonal imbalance that's ongoing, you're not going to be able to lose weight. And so I think it's short-sighted to say you can out-exercise whatever it is they're eating like that. Like maybe my teenagers who have voluminous diets, they can probably at this stage of the game, they can. But I think once you start getting, beyond 25 years old, you just can't. And so it really speaks to the fact, whether it's cortisol, insulin, leptin, ghrelin, all these hormones, and men and women both have estradiol and testosterone. I remind people that when those hormones are not properly balanced, then you are going to struggle with weight loss resistance. There's a lot that plays into that, of course, but the calories in, calories out model, to me, is too simplistic. I think our bodies are far more sophisticated, and I'm very, very aligned with looking at how the hormones interplay with weight loss resistance, weight gain, challenges that people are experiencing, because our bodies are far more sophisticated than that.
And is it that hormones affect the calories outside of that equation? Is that how the energy balance model gets reconciled with this sort of more hormone centric view?
Well, when I look at someone saying to me, I'm weight loss resistant, I've tried everything, I start thinking about thyroid hormones. I start thinking about leptin and ghrelin. What's their appetite doing? Are they ever satiated? Do they have so much adipose tissue that the leptin signaling in their body is so dysregulated, their brain doesn't know that they're full? Is their insulin level so high because they are eating so frequently, they never get an opportunity to actually go to utilizing both fats and stored fats and glucose as an energy source? So when I look at it from my perspective, it's really examining on a multi-layered approach what could be going on that's contributing to these imbalances in the body that are making them or allowing them to feel like they're holding on to adipose tissue that they would not otherwise have. I think it's important for people to understand that calories do matter, but our bodies take in more information from the foods we eat. How much fat quantity are you consuming? Even if it's the healthy avocado, if you eat 5 avocados a day, that is a much more nutrient dense food. We're looking at carbohydrates and protein, which are 4 calories per gram, and you're looking at fats or 9 calories per gram. I mean, you can outdo a good otherwise diet. So I remind people it's nutrient density of the food you're consuming, along with these hormonal balances that really play a large role. Now, if someone is saying like, I'm being really conscientious and I'm focusing on protein and I'm eating the right healthy fats and the right portions and I'm not eating processed carbs, then that is someone that's going to have better hormonal balance in terms of hunger cues, satiety, insulin levels, and eating less frequently than someone who's eating, let's say, 5 Big Macs a day. They're definitely going to have less inflammation, less oxidative stress. You can assume that they have healthier mitochondria. And that's really important. I always like to point out that, we can get nerdy and get down to a cellular level and talk about what's happening in the body, but just from a very kind of high level, explaining to people that not all food is created equal. Not all foods are going to contribute to being able to be in a position where you can lose weight fairly easily. But I do find that the hormonal imbalances are at the basis for nearly every weight loss resistant individual that I work with. And I do work with so many of them. By the time they get to like where I am, they're pretty frustrated. And a lot of it's a combination of a variety of different factors. But I do think that the calories in, calories out model does a huge disservice, because if it were that simple, then we would all be able to lose weight effortlessly, right? If it was really just about calories and nothing else, that would be, you could just, ride your bike for 100 miles and you can burn off all that excess fat, but our bodies are so much more sophisticated than that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. So what is the benefit then of intermittent fasting? How does intermittent fasting fix for all these account and ultimately cater to all these different challenges?
Yeah, well, I think from a very basic level, when we think about our body being able to be metabolically flexible, being able to utilize both carbohydrates and fats as a fuel substrate, we all want that. That's ideal. What most of us are stuck in is this the substrate of just using carbohydrates. And that's a quick use fuel. It doesn't sustain your energy. If your body is not able to be flexible and tap into stored fat for energy, you're not going to have sustained energy. You're going to struggle with weight loss resistance. You're probably going to get hangry when you get hungry, versus this, this fat substrate, which takes more time. I always like Jason Fung's analogy when he talks about the refrigerator. You open up the fridge, what's in the refrigerator are carbohydrates. You have to burn through all those before you can get to the freezer where you have the stored fat. So I always remind people, you have to go long enough without eating to allow your body to use up this stored fuel before it can get to the better stuff, the stuff that's going to give you sustained energy in between meals, mental clarity, et cetera. So when you get to a point when you're fasting long enough, and sometimes people are starting with 12 hours of digestive rest. And for a lot of people, that will help optimize digestion, make them feel a whole lot better. But as you're longer into a fasted state, as you are becoming more fat adapted, where your body can go in and use this stored fuel for energy, it'll free up these special types of fats called ketones. And the ketones are incredibly efficient. Our brain loves the use of ketones. They will diffuse across the blood-brain barrier. There's a specific one called beta hydroxybutyrate. And this is where people, when they're in a fasted state, they'll say, oh my gosh, I have so much energy. I have so much mental clarity. So that's usually number one. The changes in body composition and weight loss may not happen instantaneously. This is where men and women will differ. And if you're looking at 8-week-long, trials, oftentimes men will lose weight more effectively up front. Men have less body fat typically. They have more muscle mass. They are more metabolically flexible typically in an ideal circumstance, whereas women have a menstrual cycle. And on top of that, usually more body fat and less lean muscle mass. So it may take a little bit more time. But over time, as our bodies are able to kind of adapt to utilizing fats as this preferred fuel source, it lowers our biophysical markers. We're going to have improved fasting insulin, glucose, triglycerides, HDL, blood pressure, we get a reduction in oxidative stress and inflammation. So people will sometimes say, my joints ache less. I have more energy. I can get out and do more walking. It lessens our likelihood of developing certain types of neurocognitive disorders like Parkinson's, Alzheimer's. And I'm sure many of your listeners know that Alzheimer's, we think of as type 3 diabetes. So it's, most women are protected from Alzheimer's until they go through menopause, because we know estrogen is an insulin sensitizing hormone. But both men and women can be at risk, but women tend to be at greater risk once they go through menopause. And then really thinking about the net effect of autophagy, this waste and recycling process, which I think is one of the coolest things. This is balanced with another process in the body, a growth process called mTOR. But autophagy is when our body will actually go in an unfed state. It'll get rid of diseased mitochondria, cytozymes, things that don't belong, and things that could potentially go on to developing pre-cancer or even cancer, certain types of cancer. So when we're looking at the benefits for intermittent fasting, people like to focus on the physicality of it all. And certainly that's important for a lot of people. But I think what's really at the root, or what's critically important to understand about fasting, is that it's a really way to optimize our health. And there's so many net benefits, but the improvement in autophagy, that waste and recycling process, we know that people north of 40 have mitochondrial dysfunction. If you're under the age of 40 and you've got chronic Lyme or you've got chronic health problems, you already have mitochondrial dysfunction. And this is a way to get rid of mitochondria that are tired, worn out, and need to be replaced. And it's a way to ensure that you are creating healthy mitochondria.
I love it. So I think, you've listed off a number of really significant benefits that I think it's important for listeners to uncouple from weight loss, because weight loss can be achieved with or without intermittent fasting. If it's a tool for you to help curtail calorie consumption, then that's fantastic. But I think what's also exciting about intermittent fasting is that it provides all these additional health span related benefits that, you've listed: healthy, better glucose control. I've seen better blood pressure regulation. So when it comes to an intermittent fasting regimen or protocol, what does the science tell us about how to set up our feeding window, where that feeding window should sort of sit in the day, and so forth?
Yeah, and it's a good question. So if you look at chronobiology research, or if you're looking at circadian biology, we actually do better eating earlier in the day. Like, I remind people to eat when it's light outside and don't eat when it's dark outside. We become physiologically more insulin resistant as the day goes on. I'm not suggesting not to enjoy dinners out with your families or friends or celebrations, but if we really look at the science, we do better eating earlier in the day, probably eating our first meal by 10 or 11 a.m., eating again in the afternoon. And it's really based on what works for you. But I find most people, and I have a lot of patients with continuous glucose monitors and glucometers, so they're monitoring their blood sugar throughout the day, that for me, I find that for a lot of people, when they're first starting out with fasting, it's really retraining your mindset around food, because we've been conditioned to believe we have to eat in between meals. We need to have snacks in between meals. We're not really prioritizing our macros when we're eating a meal. So step number one is getting rid of snacking, because no one should be snacking. In fact, I'm always yelling at my teenagers, you didn't eat enough at dinner if you have to then have a snack 2 hours later, but they're still growing. So that's a whole separate conversation. So number one, you want to stop snacking. Number two is, when you sit down to put meals together, the priority is protein. Protein is satiating. Protein helps with muscle protein synthesis. The more muscle mass we have, the more, insulin sensitive we are. I think it's important to think about fats and carbohydrates as levers that we pull depending on, where we are. Did you have a very heavy workout? Maybe this is a day you're going to do protein and non-starchy carbs, or, maybe you add in squash or sweet potato or whatever it is that you do well with. Or maybe this is a day, maybe you've done HIIT or Tabata and you're going to put, lean protein with some healthy fats. Or if you've got a ribeye, you've got all your healthy fats inside that protein, and really structuring your meals accordingly. So remove the snacks, then you are moving to making sure your macros are properly structured, so you're not hungry in between meals. And then the next step is really saying, okay, after dinner, I'm not going to eat anything until I eat breakfast the following day. And then that's when you slowly can open up that feeding and fasting window. Now, I find the more carbohydrate dependent someone is, the more insulin resistant they It can take longer to get to a point where they're doing 16 hours fasted with an 8-hour feeding window. But I think it's also important to kind of interject that for each person who kind of struggles with opening up that fasting window, it's really giving yourself, maybe every week you're opening it by 30 minutes or an hour until you're slowly at that point. But about 16 hours fast is when we start seeing this upregulation in autophagy and improvements in some of the benefits that I just talked about. And then the goal is really to find something that's sustainable. So you could have 100 people listening to this right now, and they might all have to fast a little bit differently. We know men and menopausal women have a little bit less restrictions on when they can fast versus, lean women under the age of 35 should not be fasting every day. They may fast during the first 2 weeks of their menstrual cycle, which is the follicular phase when estrogen predominates. They can push their workouts. They can maybe eat, low carb ketogenic diets, but then as they go into the luteal phase, which is the second half of the menstrual cycle when progesterone predominates, they need to back off on longer fasts. They're not doing the same type of exercise. And then the next kind of area that we talk about is perimenopause. And so perimenopause and menopause, the one caveat I always say is you have to focus on sleep. We get away with a lot until, we go through these middle-age transitions. Sleep becomes a huge priority. We know sleep is critically important for weight loss. It's important for appetite regulation. It's important for glucose sensitivity, stress management. That doesn't mean 2 minutes of meditation in the morning. That means you actively have to practice some type of stress management, right types of exercise. Gone are the days where women or men for that matter should just be doing chronic cardio. It's much better to be doing strength training. I always say we want to maintain muscle mass. That is so, so important. So right types of exercise. And then nutrition, which unfortunately I listed last, but as always to me is super important. Anti-inflammatory nutrition, really depending on who you are in your time and space. I just find as people start getting chronologically a little older, all of a sudden things like gluten and grains and dairy may not work for you. And if they do work for you, great. Alcohol is another one. I think the last 2 years, there are probably people that, might have been one extreme or the other. Either they were drinking more, drinking less, choosing not to drink. Alcohol can be incredibly disruptive to our sleep schedules and can, dysregulate cortisol and melatonin and, can impact REM sleep. And so I know many, many people that are no longer drinking because it's maybe the one thing that impacts their sleep quality pretty significantly. So if we're aligned with chronobiology, it's really looking as eating when it's light outside, trying to really align with that, not eating within 2 to 3 hours of bedtime. We actually have melatonin clocks, not just the pineal gland in our brain, but we actually have melatonin clocks in our gut. And I remind people that if we eat a huge bolus of food at 9:00 at night and you try to lay down at 10, guess what? Your body is trying to digest that food. It is not in a position where it's going to be secreting a lot of melatonin. It's going to be secreting cortisol in an effort to get that food moved along, and can be really disruptive to your sleep schedule. So I always say that you want to align yourself with a schedule that's going to work for your personal and professional life. Obviously, you and I are entrepreneurs, so we probably have a bit more flexibility in our schedules. But when I was running in the hospital, there's no way I could have stopped to eat breakfast or breaking my fast at 10 or 11 a.m. I was lucky if I got to eat at all. And so it's really, finding what works for you in your personal circumstances, but finding, a 6 to 8 hour window in which you are consuming at least 2, if not 3 meals. Maybe some people are having a protein shake or they're having bone broth to get their protein needs met. But really, realigning your macros, stopping the snacking, trying your darndest to have a period of time during the day where you're not consuming food is incredibly beneficial.
I'm sure there are some people that are listening to this, though, and that are going to interpret this as an excuse to not eat their first calorie or their first meal rather, until 2 p.m. and then to eat their last meal at 10 p.m. Right? Is that would you say that that's a proper implementation of this protocol of intermittent fasting?
Well, I mean, a lot of it depends on someone's personal circumstances. We do know that if you're eating in the evening, you're going to, you can disrupt your sleep. You're less insulin sensitive. And those are things to consider. We are much more insulin sensitive. And I say we as in women, we are much more insulin sensitive until we go into perimenopause, as we have these fluctuations in progesterone and estrogen. And certainly if we look at the statistics on men and women north of 40 years old, the degree of metabolic inflexibility, you really have to be mindful about meal times. I know this isn't sexy to talk about this, but we really have to be mindful of when we eat and what we choose to eat at that time. So if someone says to me, the way that my schedule works, I can only eat at 2 p.m. and 10 p.m., I would say if you're going to have carbohydrates, have them earlier in the day, especially if you're someone that is not metabolically flexible yet. And I always say yet, because there's always hope. I do have friends in the health and wellness space, guys that will have a large bolus of carbohydrates at dinner, but they're also very metabolically flexible. And so I always remind people that so much of it's dependent on what works for you and your life circumstances. But I can tell you most women, if you're going to have carbs, they should be non-starchy carbs. They should be eaten earlier in the day and not right before bedtime, because, as you're becoming more insulin resistant as the day goes on, I sometimes will recommend, take a 10 or a 15-minute walk after dinner. That will help with insulin sensitivity. And that's literally a no-cost way of improving insulin sensitivity heading into bedtime.
Well, is it more optimal than, like, say you have a degree of lifestyle flexibility, mm-hmm. and you're trying to say, okay, where you're trying to plot out where you're at, what time, the time at which you're going to break your fast, and then the time at which you're going to close up the faucet and close down the kitchen. It would be better to eat your first meal earlier in the day as opposed to later, and then have your last meal also earlier as opposed to later?
Yes. If you look at the research that's done on, chronobiology and the circadian biology, now not everyone can do that. I've had the social experiment of the last 2 years and, wearing a continuous glucose monitor, and my body likes to have my last meal by 5 o'clock, like 6 is pushing it. And I always say to my husband, like, I don't ever want my children to interpret that, mom can't eat after 6 o'clock at night. But if I trend my data, and I'm metabolically flexible, I'm a healthy weight, it's amazing to me the difference of I eat dinner at 5 o'clock versus 7:30. And so when I'm looking and talking to people, I always say, I'd rather you eat at 11 and 3 or 10 and 2. And then maybe you have something small right around dinner time, if that works for you, if you're hungry. But always aiming, and this is, we have a mutual friend, Gabrielle Line. I always say, like, the one big takeaway from everything I've learned from her is really pushing that protein envelope. And so reminding people, like, I want you to aim for no less than 100 grams of protein a day. And you have to work at that, because most people are grossly under eating protein all day long.
Yeah, it's definitely difficult to hit those macros, especially, for women, for men. If you're the heavier you are, assuming you're lean, you have to eat more. Generally, it's like, exactly. I think 0.7 grams per pound of lean mass.
Yep.
Is the requisite amount. When I was first getting started with intermittent fasting, before really doing a deep dive into the research, I'd eat around noon, but sometimes I would push it, and I would feel like I was actually doing it better if I pushed it to 1 to 2 p.m. and then I would have my last meal at 9 or 10 p.m. But actually, my view on that has changed. Mm-hmm. I started to see references to early time restricted feeding and a lot of clinical literature on that. And I think at this point, I now have my first meal at around, 10:30, 11 sometimes, but like maybe noon. If I'm busy, but if I have the ability to have my first meal at around 10:30, 11. And also if I'm hungry at that point, if I want to eat, I'll eat. And then I try to eat I try to curtail all of my food consumption to 3 hours before bed. Maybe even more. However, I think the problem with early time restricted feeding, when we actually apply it in the practical sense, is that dinner is our most social meal, right? Like nobody cares what I'm doing all day, right? I'm eating in isolation because I'm usually eating in between meetings or in my house. But dinner is the opportunity where we get to sit across the table from loved ones, from friends. And so it can be really, I think, impractical. Yes. So how do we reconcile that?
Well, I think, first of all, I would say from a practical perspective as a mom, I have kids going in 2 different directions. I've got a lacrosse player right now and a swim team kid. And I will sit down with them at dinner, because one's eating dinner at 9 o'clock at night. One's eating dinner at 7 o'clock at night. And the only time as a family we all eat together is on the weekend. I always make time. I always ensure that on the weekend, we all sit together. They all entertain my crazy early dinner time. I always will push it. It's 6:30, 7:00 on the weekends because I want to connect with them. Obviously, if I'm traveling, last week I was in Salt Lake and we went out to dinner with friends that were at the same event. And we went to dinner, 6:00 at night, which was 8:00 my time, which was definitely later. But I absolutely agree with you. I think in light of the past 2 years in particular, connecting with people that we care about is so, so important. But I think we have to be flexible. I think that's the one thing about fasting that is important for people to understand. It is designed to be flexible. So on a day I'm going to eat dinner a little later, I break my fast a little later. And that works well for me. I can also tell you when I do public speaking, I like to talk fasted because I know I'm going to have a lot more like mental clarity to be able to get through those talks and be able to execute them. But I'll be the first person to say that rigidity can be problematic. I think there are a lot of people that if a little bit of fasting is good, then it means more fasting is better. And so I like to remind people that fasting is meant to be something that's like a muscle that you flex. We work at adaptation, we work at finding strategies that work well for us, but it doesn't have to be rigid. So you were saying like during the day, I'm by myself, I'm fine eating by myself, but I want to enjoy dinner with loved ones. And I think that's very important. I would never discount that. But there are nights, I'll be totally honest, there are nights I've closed my window. I still sit with my family. I'll drink water and whatever. They understand that I've already closed my feeding window. But I hear from people all the time that they're worried about that. And I said, explain to your children or to your family what you're doing. I've never had a problem with someone not understanding that, but absolutely positively, if it's a celebration, something special, those Saturday and Sunday evening dinners for my family are very important. It's a time when we all eat at the same time. And I have to be flexible and I'm completely fine with that. And I think it's important for people to not feel like they have to be rigid.
I love that. I would retweet that many, many times. Let's talk a little bit about this recent New England Journal of Medicine paper that was published. Mm-hmm. It's making the rounds on social media. It's been picked up by numerous publications. I think it was the New York Times that the headline was, time-restricted feeding provides no weight loss benefit when compared to calorie restriction. It's led to fervor online because you have people that are saying, well, that's actually an improper interpretation of this research. And then others saying almost like see, I told you so, that intermittent fasting is a useless tool in the toolkit. So what's your take on this? You must have seen it.
No, I did. And actually on Friday, I did a very short IG live because I had gotten so many DMs that I was like, I feel like I have to respond to this. So I went in and looked at the New England Journal of Medicine article. And the first thing that really stood out to me was when you looked at the diet. First of all, it wasn't observed. They were supposed to consume 40 to 50% carbs, only 15 to 20% protein. So that's already telling me it's not a diet that's designed to, or a nutrition program that's designed to be particularly healthy. They had to consume a shake and they had some type of processed bar or product that they were designed to take, but there was no observation of food. So who knows what people were consuming. So that was a huge issue for me. They had no controls for physical activity. It's interesting. It says here they excluded people that had diabetes, but the BMI of individuals that were involved in this study were anywhere from 28 to 45. Now, 28 might be someone who could be muscular and they just have a BMI of 28, but a BMI of 45 is certainly someone who's not metabolically healthy by any estimation.
Now that's obesity, right?
Right, exactly. And so I just looked at it, I was like, seriously? But they didn't have diabetes. They had to. So anyway, the other thing that stood out, they were looking at BMI, waist circumference, glucose, lipids, and blood pressure. They didn't focus on any other variables as it pertains to intermittent fasting. There were no changes in lean body mass by those people who fasted. And the fasting actually worked better overall, but wasn't statistically significant. So to me, it doesn't really demonstrate anything that's going to cause me any pause. And that's kind of how I started my IG Live. I said, this is not changing my practice. This is not changing my recommendations. There were certainly aspects to this study that for me really said, well, I mean, that's interesting, but I wouldn't extrapolate that to say that this now shows or demonstrates intermittent fasting is unsafe, not valuable. given the fact that they didn't really have like a super healthy population that they were utilizing or that they randomized, and their macros were terrible. Like, who knows? These people could have sat back and had that shake and then eaten just a bunch of carbohydrates all day. And if they're already insulin resistant, that's not going to put them in a state. And what the other thing was interesting, the 8-hour feeding window was 8 to 4. So, there were just a lot of questions that then, led me to believe this is clickbait. This is something, given the fact that there's a lot of popularity about intermittent fasting, time restricted feeding. And there's not, there's not a way for the processed food industry to really benefit from people eating less frequently. So what do they want to do? There's an incentive to try desperately to disprove that this is a valuable strategy. And I didn't have an opportunity to go down the rabbit hole to look at who funded this. That was my next question, was who actually sat behind and actually funded this research. It was done in China. That was the other thing. But the big things were the macros breakdown, no observation of food. And that's why nutritional research is actually quite challenging, that it's very hard to have a control group and be able to observe them 24/7. And most self-reported, we know if people are reporting what they ate, they tend to tell us what we want them to think. Like they're going to tell us what they think we want them to be eating, as opposed to necessarily what's healthy. But a 40 to 50% carbohydrate diet, the women were 1,200 to 1,500 calories and men were 1,500 to 1,800. If half of that was carbohydrates, that's not healthy. So to me, it wasn't really indicative of the type of macro management that I would expect to see with someone that is metabolically inflexible and someone who's likely insulin resistant, if not diabetic. Although they keep saying they excluded diabetics, but the BMIs don't suggest that.
Yeah, there was definitely some obesity in the cohort. Was the calorie restricted group? Correct me if I'm wrong, but were they not also time restricted to some degree? I think it was like 8 hours for the time restricted group, and then 4. It was like 10 hours or something like that for the calorie restriction group, which is not really a good control, right? Because most of the problem, as you mentioned earlier in our conversation, most people are eating 16 hours a day. So I feel like there's that, but then also the benefits of time restricted feeding are not exclusive to weight loss.
And that's what they were focused on. Yeah.
Right.
And that's the one thing. And it's interesting because Huberman, I'm sure Huberman Lab, he on Twitter was talking about it and saying like, I want to have a journal club talking about this because this has just become so problematic that people are now thinking, oh, well, there's no value to intermittent fasting. You said, wait a minute, that's not what the point of this is. And so there was a long thread of conversation about this on Twitter, and people saying, well, make sure you include this researcher, and let's like have a vibrant discussion. I'm not sure.
And also if it worked, even if it worked as well as calorie restriction, that's not no benefit.
Right.
It worked as well as calorie restriction.
Right. Exactly. And what's interesting is, when you look at like really breaking things down, not meeting statistical significance doesn't necessarily mean that there's no value in it. And so that was the big crux. Like when I sat down and looked at it, I was like, okay, well, let's like look at the information and let's just say, okay, this is, it just means we need to do more research. We need to, nutritional research in general tends to be challenging for a variety of reasons, largely because it's onerous, having to factor in, observing someone eating certain types of foods. We don't know how old. I don't recall it listed the age of the patient. So there's a lot of different variables that could be in play for women. I mean, I always go back to that saying a menstruating woman versus a menopausal woman is going to be very different in terms of their response to, caloric restriction versus time restricted eating. And so for me, this just begs the conversation that we need to continue looking for more research, certainly more research focused on both genders. And this is just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, to me, it's like, okay, that's helpful to a point. I mean, it will not discourage what I recommend to my patients, and certainly not on social media, but I had a good, I'm sure you were getting lots of DMs about it too. I mean, to me, it was crazy. I just said, I have to do a video just so that people will calm down. It's like, it's okay. This does not mean that intermittent fasting is bad. That's not what this is saying, but that's the clickbait. That's what the media oftentimes will skim the surface of a research article and then they run with it and then they, make it sensationalized and then it gets propagated and it's all of a sudden, it's like telephone, this person tells this person. And then before you know it, the study is completely taken out of context. And there's a lot of time wasted about nonsense.
Yeah. And also, if intermittent fasting works for you, then you should keep doing it. Like, I think that we rely sometimes too much on scientific data. And if we're talking about an intervention that is safe, and it's not adding money to anybody else's pockets, right? I mean, like you've written this wonderful book, but your TED Talk is available for free for anybody to watch, right? You're taking the time, an hour out of your day to jump on this podcast, which is free, right? To share with people the potential benefits of intermittent fasting. So I think we all need to like calm down a little bit and be a bit more forgiving when we see that these kinds of modalities, these kinds of intermittent interventions are working for a significant number of people.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's the beauty of the N of one. It's the beauty of bio-individuality. And I think if intermittent fasting is working for you and you feel great and you have energy and you sleep, keep doing it. I mean, to me, it is so silly. It's like we want to be dogmatic and polarizing, and yet it doesn't need to be that way.
Yeah, I agree. Okay, so let's get back to the actionable aspect of the conversation. When it comes to breaking one's fast, like the first meal of the day, what are there any stipulations, any requirements for that first meal, any best practices?
For me, it's always a protein focused meal. I don't care if someone has bone broth. I don't care if they have a high quality protein shake. I don't care if they eat a piece of chicken or a piece of steak or a piece of pork, but it's protein, protein, protein. Because as we stated earlier, this is the super important macronutrient. And in order to get enough into your feeding window, you have to start with protein. So protein and carbs or protein and fat, never carbohydrates and fat together. Yes, carbohydrates and fats are delicious, but it doesn't hit those same satiety cues. So very, very important and really dependent on how active are you that day, I carb cycle for full disclosure. So to me, that's how I think, how active am I that day? And that's how I decide if it's protein and fats or protein and carbs. And so really ensuring that you are hitting those protein macros. I aim for 40 to 50 grams of protein in a meal. That isn't where I started. So I always tell people, eat more than you were before. Like I have a husband who still does jujitsu and plays lacrosse. And when I look at his lunches, sometimes I'm like, where's the protein? And so it becomes this ongoing joke, but protein is what sends those satiety cues. It makes us feel full. It's going to help with muscle protein synthesis. So I remind people, start with protein. Protein will absolutely break your fast. That's not a bad thing. Adding in non-starchy carbs or healthy fats, depending on what you're doing, but really ensuring you do some experimentation. I have some people who don't want to eat a meal when they first break their fast. So they'll have bone broth, or they can have a protein shake, or maybe they're having, if they tolerate dairy, maybe they're having, full fat Greek yogurt. Maybe they're having like a light salad, but I would encourage people to experiment a little bit, but you want to have a little bit of protein to make sure you're satiated. Many people then will have another meal 4 or 5 hours later, and that's usually what's optimal. If you're having a light meal and then you're having a real meal an hour later, that's fine as well. But I would encourage people to experiment because some people do really well with 2 big meals a day and they'll hit their protein macros that way. Other people need to divide them into 3, or they need to start with something small up front because maybe their body's just not ready to process a larger meal. But I think if you focus on the protein, the rest will kind of fall into place.
That's such great advice. I refuse to break my fast with anything other than protein. For example, take fruit as an example. I love fruit, right? I'll eat fruit all day long, whole fruit, but I wouldn't break my fast with an apple.
Yep.
I would break my fast with a few servings of Greek yogurt or a protein shake and an apple, but it's not going to be just the apple. I'm gonna hold out until I get that nice bolus of protein because I feel like to break a fast, you want to send the signal to your body that you are breaking the fast. And
exactly,
what are the 2 key pathways that tell your body that the fast is over, right? It's like the insulin signaling pathway. So you want to spike insulin, and mTOR, right? You want to activate mTOR, which tells your muscles, hey, hey,
time to eat.
Yeah, it's time to eat. It's time to fortify, right? So that we can continue to go about the day and do all the many things that we have to do. So with regard to protein, what are some of your favorite proteins, and then how do you integrate them into your meals?
Yeah. So we tend to be like, I always use the term wilditarian because I like a variety of protein. So we like bison, we eat steak, we eat pork. We got a little adventurous during the pandemic and started trying like elk and ostrich. I would say ostrich was not a win. We don't eat a lot of chicken. We do eat some turkey. I love eggs. I mean, eggs, I could eat eggs every day, but I try not to eat them every day. I do like fish, but when I eat fish, I have to buy it the day of. So I like salmon, I like tuna. And we try to make sure we're cycling our proteins. It's very easy to kind of get into a rut and make the same thing all the time. But I would say bison and eggs are like a huge favorite, huge favorite. But we do try to cycle our proteins. And I have 2 teenage boys, and the amount of protein that they eat is just unbelievable. Like my husband and I'll make 4 pounds of, shredded pork, and then it's gone in a day and a half. I'm like, where do they put it? But yeah, in our house, we tend to like we're very big on trying new things. My kids like shellfish. I mean, they'll eat scallops, they'll eat shrimp. But again, with food prices continuing to go up, especially protein, it becomes this ongoing joke. I'm like, can we try to eat a more reasonable portion? I don't want to limit them, but especially if you're looking for pasture, grass-fed, wild caught. I mean, the bulk of our grocery bills are related to protein.
Well, that's an interesting tangent. What have you? I mean, you're a hardworking, busy mom of two, right?
2. Mm-hmm.
Yeah. Have you found any hacks worthwhile to share with my audience to help save money, especially with regard to protein? Yeah,
I would say, I mean, if you are able to if you can buy a cow share, so even if you get a quarter of a cow, that can be great. The irony is 2 of us like leaner meat and 2 of us like fattier meat. And so doing a cow share is a great option because it's very cost effective, especially because of the fact that 50% of our household likes leaner meats and 50% likes fattier meats. I would say meal planning, it's not sexy, but really like getting down to meal planning and meal prep. Like we do meal prep twice a week. When it comes to economical stuff, we do pay attention to what's on sale in the grocery store. We make a lot of stuff at home. In fact, my husband is a really, really good cook, as am I, but he's a really good cook. And I say all the time, like 99.9% of the time, he's going to cook a better meal, or we're going to cook a better meal at home than we will in a restaurant. So we don't eat out a lot. Friday is the only day I don't cook. So we try to, I let the kids pick, Kava or one of those places that's a little bit cleaner. But I would say the big thing is buying meat in bulk if you're able to do so. And recognizing like you can get like wild caught, like pole caught tuna in a can. You can get wild caught salmon in a can. I mean, you can get sardines. I mean, there's all sorts of ways that you can get protein in more expensive ways. But generally I find like buying a whole chicken is going to be less expensive than buying chicken breasts. And so just getting savvy, understanding, sometimes having the whole meal. I mean, it's not always like my favorite thing to butcher stuff, but if we have to cut things down at home, I'm fine doing that. But I would say if you've got the available space, you've got a freezer that you can keep, larger quantities of meat in, that's a super good way to do it. Eventually I know we will get beyond the teenage years, but we're in the thick of it. Like I jokingly say my 2 teenage boys eat enough food for 4 people. So it's really like we have a family of 6 and not 4.
Wow. I had a big appetite when I was a kid.
Yeah.
Any low cost proteins that you happen to like?
Yeah, I would say, some people might scream at this, but like pole caught tuna, you can get canned salmon, I make a really delicious sardine pate, which is really just sardines and butter. Those are usually things.
You just mash up sardines with some butter?
Yeah, you put it in like the blend. It's pretty awesome. I'll have to send you the recipe. It's good.
And your kids like it?
They don't. Yeah, they do because they like it because sardines are salty. And so, you put that on for them. If I let them have like a loaf of French bread, I'm not eating the bread. But I can have gluten-free crackers or things like that. It's kind of cool.
That sounds really tasty. These days, I don't do a ton of butter, but for people who might be dairy free, is there like an alternate that you've experimented with?
I mean, you can definitely use clarified butter, which is ghee. I mean, I'm dairy sensitive. I do okay with butter. I don't eat large quantities because, again, we talked about how fats are calorically dense. And so like being mindful that, the teenagers can eat voluminous amounts of butter and they're impervious to it. I have to be careful about quantities. So I'll just have my small portion and I'm good with that. But I think that, clarified butter is certainly an option. And I think a lot of people I'm certainly one of them. Like I like lighter fats. And this is the only time you're hearing me say the phrase plant-based fats, but like I do better with coconut oil and avocado and olive oil and olives than I do with animal-based fat. So if it's lard or tallow, there's nothing wrong with those things. Duck fat, I love duck fat. Like duck fat fries are just delicious. But if I eat them, I'm not a happy person. They're too heavy.
Interesting. Is this because of just the way they make you feel, or is it like a cardio,
No, I suspect. Yeah, it's interesting. If I ask my practitioner, I'm not fat malabsorbed. It's not an issue. Like I don't have a gallbladder problem, but heavier fats just don't make me feel good. They actually make me feel nauseous, which kind of speaks to the gallbladder piece, but I've never had a gallbladder problem. But I can eat all the olives in the world. But if you ask me to eat duck fat, I would probably be super nauseous. And so it's honoring that bio-individuality of just saying the like lighter fats I do fine with, heavier fats I don't. And it goes along with, half my family can eat fatty cuts of meat. Like they'll salivate over a ribeye. That would make me gag. Give me the filet. I'm good with that. But it's really honoring, I'll do fine with a New York strip, but it's like honoring who we are as individuals. And so, my older son, same way, he gags over, if he sees visible fat on something, it'll make him gag. So
really,
I just said, yeah. And that's just, he's been that way his entire life. He's almost 17. And I always say to my husband, let him be. I totally get it. It's a texture thing.
I think I was like that when I was younger also. But I think when I learned the distinction between fat and collagenous tissue, connective tissue, I realized that it wasn't the fat that grossed me out. It was like the chewy collagenous aspect of meat sometimes that you get in a cheaper cut. Yep. Or what have you. It's not actually the fat. The fat on ribeye, I'll eat all day long. Yeah. It's so tasty. And it doesn't have a weird texture. It's the more collagenous parts.
And that's a good point. It's interesting. My husband did a lot of Asia travel, and in Asia they eat butt to beef. They eat everything. And my husband's eaten some pretty unusual things. And he's said, over the years that, all that travel, we've done a lot of travel together, and he's far more food adventurous than I am. He's like, every once in a while I would get something. I go, I don't think I want to eat that. But I think we have to be open to trying things. And so that's what I always encourage my kids. Like ostrich was a big no in our house. Like all four of us said ostrich, not our favorite protein. Elk, we did like elk. We thought that was great.
My mom growing up, I was a really picky eater. And my mom used to tell me when I was a kid that girls wouldn't like, if you were a picky eater, girls weren't going to like you as much as somebody who was like more experimental. And I think it's true. I think there's some truth to that.
Well, I think, for me, I've always had a love for travel, and that was something my parents invested in me. And it's something my husband and I, that we definitely connected over that. And so I love that he was food adventurous, and our kids are pretty food adventurous, and we travel a lot with them. And so I always say, just try, being open to trying new things is really important. Like being curious about the world, being open-minded, trying new things, I think is really important.
Super
Otherwise,
important.
we're boring. Yeah. Otherwise it's pretty boring. If all you eat is steak and broccoli, life gets, kind of boring.
Yeah. And who wants to go out with a boring person?
Yeah,
right?
Exactly.
Be adventurous.
Yes.
Try things.
Yes. Yeah. We're taking our first trip to Europe this summer in a while. Obviously, no one's been doing a lot of Europe travel, and we're going to a part of Europe we haven't been to. And so I was saying to the kids, we're going to have to be open to trying new things. And so, they've been very food adventurous when we've traveled before. So I'm excited.
Hey, if you like that video, you need to check out this one here, and I'll see you there.
I also have a lot of athletes that do not require carbohydrates, that do very well in a more protein adapted plate. Just as we were talking before, that for every 100 grams of protein that you ingest, you generate 60 grams of carbohydrates.